Hi everyone, welcome to Watch Hags. I'm Ken.
I'm David.
And behind the camera as always, our buddy Wilson. Welcome to our second Homage episode. Our Homage series we created to pay tribute to brands that we love here at the Hags, to talk a little bit about its history, talk about some of the key models in its lineup, and what's so special about that brand that we love so much. At Watch Hags, we're also very happy and proud to say that we're an independent brand, we're an independent channel providing objective feedback and input around horology and watches in general, representing not just our views but our friends' views, with no sponsorship at all. And today, for our second Homage series, we're going to focus on Tudor. So to get us started, David, you've probably been the longest fan of Tudor in the Hags. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what's special about it?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I'm really excited about today to share a little bit about why I really enjoy the brand. But before we go there, there's a theme at Watch Hags where we always like to get immersed a little bit about the history. And to me, always that's been something that intrigues me about any brand that I go after. And so for Tudor, I think most people for a long time have always kind of thought about Tudor as being, the cheap alternative to Rolex.
Yeah.
And yes, I can see how that's come about over time, especially where Mr. Hans Wilsdorf, who founded Rolex, also officially founded the Tudor Watch Company. So if you go back to 1926, that's actually when the brand was first registered in Switzerland by the Veuve Philippe Hutter family. And so back then, that family and his namesake, he was actually a watch dealer and a watchmaker collaborating with Mr. Wilsdorf.
Yep.
And so Mr. Wilsdorf, he saw an opportunity here. And so he actually then acquired the full rights to use the name, and then working with the family, ended up releasing their first watch about almost 10 years later to the Australian market. And now if you go back to that day, a lot has changed since then. Probably the most obvious, beyond the shape and the size, when back in those days, it was more of a kind of rectangular tonneau shape. Then of course the size much smaller, below 35, mostly around 30 to 33 millimeters.
Yeah.
But then also the Tudor name itself, it started off as a long T across all the other letters. And now what we associate Tudor today with having the rose and the shield, that really didn't come about until about 10 years later, in 1936. And so the Tudor Rose and Shield, what we're all most familiar with, started back then, but then quickly it also evolved again. And I think what we're seeing here is the innovation that the Tudor Watch Company and Mr. Wilsdorf were constantly pushing. Because after the Tudor Rose Shield came about, they ultimately just dropped the shield. This was just the rose itself. So business was going well, and the collaboration, rather the support that Tudor Watch Company had from Rolex really shone through. But quite frankly, it really didn't start taking off until after World War II. Obviously, a lot of people, a lot of companies were distracted because of that event. So a major turning point for the Tudor Watch Company in the mid-century post-World War II was the introduction of the Tudor Oyster Prince by Mr. Wilsdorf and the Tudor Watch Company. So building off of the original case design of the Oyster case by Rolex, this really became a pivotal moment for Tudor. So once the Oyster Prince was introduced, Tudor really started to have a blitz of campaigns to really position their watch to signify strength, reliability, and precision. And so they even had advertisements and testimonials from construction workers. So working on a jackhammer, for weeks on end, and the watch still performing very well. Even a professional motorbike racer who rode the motorbike for 1,000 miles still came back with the watch performing well. And even a coal miner, someone being down in the depths of a coal mine, still coming back with the watch working extremely well. And another event in 1952 that I think really solidified this reputation for Tudor was a British scientific expedition that was kicked off by the British Royal Navy, supported by the Queen of England and even Winston Churchill. They did an expedition to Greenland. And in that team, they issued 26 Oyster Prince watches to the members of the team. Having spent a few weeks in the wilderness, they all came back with testimonials that yes, this watch still performed really well. And so when you think about what Tudor did in that time, that mid-century, it really was another pivotal moment to position their watch to try to stand alone away from Rolex. And another pivotal moment for Tudor actually occurred in 1952 with the release of the Oyster Prince Submariner. So again, building off of the DNA of the original Submariner by Rolex, it was quick to see very big success in the market. It went from 100-meter rating to 200-meter rating, and then ultimately being picked up through a collaboration with the French Navy to supply it as a standard equipment for the field in the French Navy. And so that kind of brings Tudor to a point in time where I really started to resonate with what they were doing. Obviously, I wasn't around in the 50s, and later kind of discovering the brand. That to me, I saw as a pivotal moment for the brand, but then also for what I liked about them. So again, going back to the brand signifying strength, reliability and precision now in a dive watch, that really has me excited about how I want to take my collection, especially with Tudor and what they've done with their version of the Submariner. So, I've been rambling on here a little bit here, but Ken, I also want to get your opinion on what do you think about the history? How do you think it influenced what we see today within the Tudor line?
Yeah, so David, I'm a very new fan of Tudor. I have to say the history, of course, is really, really cool. The expedition to Greenland, the collaboration with the French Navy, the Tudor watch. But for me, I felt Mr. Wilsdorf took the approach of being an accessible form of Rolex too far, right? In the early models, especially in the Submariner, it looked almost like a Rolex, right? You had the Mercedes-Benz hands, you even had the same kind of fonts. The crown had the Rolex logo on it. There were just too many bits and pieces of it that just was a Rolex, right? And it was only really for me when they relaunched a number of key brands, rather the Submariner in 2012, into two different kinds of models. One was the Pelagos, which is a more hardcore dive watch, and the Black Bay. And in a way, they were kind of mirroring two models within the Rolex line. The Pelagos for the deep sea or sea dweller, the more hardcore tool dive watch, and the Black Bay mirroring the Submariner. But it was clearly an identity which had some Rolex DNA, but very, very much their own. Very, very much their own, right?
I agree.
And they took what was original from the early models of the Tudor Submariner, like the snowflake hand, the big crown. They played around with the logo, the shoe logo, the rose logo, the smiley face font orientation, and brought that in and added their own unique feel to it, right? And Tudor really arrived for me in 2012.
I agree. When you look at heritage watches that brands have come out with, quite frankly, I think Tudor has executed the best so far. It's not just an exact copy of the original watch. You can see how it was influenced through the story behind it. But then, of course, with the modern interpretation of the case size, the materials, the manufacturing, and then also the movement, right? And so this is something I also want us to talk a little bit about is the movement as well, because I think everyone is aware that for many, many years, the movement that were in Tudor watches were off the shelf, either by ETA or by Valjoux. And this was an intentional approach so that from a cost perspective, they can position the watch at a lower price point. But then also both, ETA and Valjoux, they're great movements. And so now what's interesting is that we have these kind of two camps of watch collectors, right? Like ETA and Valjoux. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, David, people know my thoughts on the ETA. I'm a big fan. So when Tudor relaunched the series in 2012 using ETA movements, it was also during a time when a lot of brands were making their own. So it was criticized in a way. But I've never been against that, right? I think ETA provides a very high quality movement that's been made for decades and has proven its capability year after year, right? And just as a great example, we have a friend of the Hag who had an original Black Bay, just recently sent it for service at the Rolex Service Center, no less, for a very economical price because it was an ETA movement. And if a Rolex Service Center was not available to you, many people know how to do it. I'm very happy that they've gone to developing their own movements, which is superior to ETA, but definitely not against ETA at all. I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I agree. And when people start thinking about or try to trash one versus the other, it's not that quite black and white. Like you talked about, it's more readily serviceable either by Rolex or other master watchmen. But so when you look at the pros and cons, I mean, yes, the ETA It has a lower power reserve
Yes.
around 40 hours. The in-house movement has a power reserve of 70 hours. But then also the new movement is thicker, right? So the case has to be thicker. So these are I think some minor things that collectors, people that want to get into Tudor, need to be aware of. But I think it's a minor point. I think it goes back to how you want to wear the watch, for what occasion, what are the aesthetics around it. But then also, does it resonate as far as the history and the story behind it?
David, thank you very much for that whirlwind tour of Tudor today.
My pleasure.
I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience have as well too. For part 2, we're going to look more closely at a few of the models that we really love about Tudor. In the meantime, thank you very much for being with us today. Please let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you, and do leave us your comments. Smash the like and subscribe button and tell us what you'd like to see in a future episode. Until next time, may time be on your side. Wear the watch, Hags.